Black Friday. The year 1650 marked the 5th consecutive year of bountiful harvests for the settlers of Ravenbrook. The harvest had been generous, with cornfields brimming and storehouses overflowing. But with the bounty came a shadow that darkened their hearts, an unspoken dread that gnawed at the very souls of Ravenbrook. As the days of November crept by, the anxiety grew, palpable as the chill in the air. Thanksgiving Day was a moment of brief respite, where the community gathered to give thanks for their fortunes. But it was the day after, a dread that settled in their bones as thickly as the frost on the early winter mornings. The settlers had a name for this shadow: Black Friday. The tax collector would come. Every year, without fail, the villagers of Ravenbrook faced his arrival with a mixture of dread and resignation. The tax collector arrived on the morning after Thanksgiving to collect the village's due. There were no documents, no written records of this arrangement. It was simply known, passed down through whispers and grim faces, that the tax must be paid. The tax collection might seem a simple matter of coin and ledger, but for the settlers, it was an annual occurrence that tightened throats and set hearts racing. In the days leading up to Black Friday, the settlement was a hive of nervous activity. The villagers prepared their homes and their minds for the inevitable visit. Small groups huddled together, exchanging solemn looks and hushed words. Children, sensing the tension in the air, played quieter, their laughter subdued, their games devoid of the usual exuberance. Sarah Winslow stood at the edge of her family's cornfield, gazing out over the withered stalks. She clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her eyes drifting to the distant forest, where the trees stood like sentinels. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a reminder of the untamed wildness that encroached upon their fragile settlement. Her husband, Thomas, approached from behind, his footsteps silent on the frost-covered ground. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm, but heavy with unspoken fear. "It's nearly time," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I know." They turned and walked back toward their home, where their children Rebecca and Samuel played in the yard. Samuel, the youngest, with his mop of unruly curls and bright, inquisitive eyes, chased after his sister with a wooden toy. Sarah's heart ached as she watched them, a pang of fear and sorrow intertwining in her chest. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Thomas busied himself with sharpening his tools, a nervous habit he had picked up over the years. Sarah sat at the table, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. "We must be strong," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. As the days crept closer to Thanksgiving, the town's anxiety grew. The men gathered in the meeting house, their discussions tense and hushed. They spoke in circles, voices rising and falling like the tides, but always returning to the same fearful refrain: the tax collector. "We have no choice," John Carver, one of the elders, said, his face drawn and pale. "The pact must be honored, or we risk everything." "But at what cost?" Another man, Edward, argued, his fists clenched on the table. "How many more must we lose before we say enough?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. No one had an answer, for they all knew the price of defiance. At home, Sarah and Thomas prepared in their own way. They spoke little, their silences filled with the unspoken terror of what was to come. On Thanksgiving morning, they gathered with their neighbors in the small chapel, giving thanks for the beautiful harvest. But their prayers were hollow, their gratitude tempered by the looming dread of Black Friday. Thanksgiving night was a solemn affair. The usual feasting and celebration were overshadowed by the knowledge of what tomorrow would bring. Sarah and Thomas put their children to bed early. As the waning moon darkened the night sky, Thomas took Sarah's hand and led her to the table, where they sat in silence. The room was dark, save for the flickering light of a single candle. The flame danced in the draught, casting eerie shadows on their faces. "Do you remember the first time?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "The first Black Friday." Thomas nodded, his eyes dark and haunted. I remember every one of them." They fell silent again, the memories too painful to speak aloud. They had been among the first to arrive in this new world, seeking freedom and a better life. But the land had been harsh, their struggles many. It was in those desperate times that the pact had been made. The elders had struck a deal with an entity from the forest, a being of ancient and malevolent power. In exchange for bountiful harvests and protection from the harsh winters, the colony would pay a tax each year, a tax not of coin, but of flesh and blood. Each year, on Black Friday, a child would be chosen by lot and offered to the entity. It had been the price of their survival, a terrible, unthinkable bargain that had ensured the prosperity of the colony, but at a cost that gnawed at their souls. As the night deepened, the settlers' fear grew. They locked their doors and windows, huddling together in their homes, praying that their family would be spared. The wind howled outside, a mournful, keening sound that seemed to echo their own despair. Sarah and Thomas lay in their bed, unable to sleep. The sound of the wind and the distant howls of the wolves kept them awake, but it was the knowledge of what was to come that truly haunted them. Dawn broke with a cold, pale light, casting long shadows over the settlement. The day had arrived, Black Friday. The town gathered in the clearing at the edge of the forest, the air thick with tension. The elders stood in a solemn line, their faces grave. John Carver stepped forward, holding a small wooden box, its surface worn by years of use. The box contained the lots, slips of paper with the names of every child in the colony. It was an instrument of fate, an arbiter of life and death. As Carver opened the box, a hush fell over the crowd. "Let us pray," he said, his voice breaking. "Let us pray for mercy." The crowd bowed their heads, but their prayers were filled with fear, not faith. They knew what was to come, and no amount of prayer could change it. Carver reached into the box and drew a slip of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it, his eyes widening in horror as he read the name. Samuel Winslow. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, and all eyes turned to Sarah and Thomas. Sarah felt the ground sway beneath her, a cry of anguish tearing from her throat. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, his own grief raw and unrestrained. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the clearing. "Not my son! Please, God, not my son!" But there was no mercy, no reprieve. The pact was unbreakable, and the price had to be paid. With heavy hearts, the settlers formed a solemn procession, leading Sarah, Thomas, and their son towards the forest. Samuel clung to his mother, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He did not understand what was happening, why his parents were crying, why the adults were so silent and grim. The forest loomed before them, dark and forbidding. As they approached, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The entity awaited, hidden within the trees, its presence a palpable, malevolent force. John Carver stepped forward, his voice trembling as he recited the ancient incantation that had been passed down through the years. The words were a plea to the entity, offering the sacrifice in exchange for continued prosperity. As the incantation ended, a low, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the forest. The trees seemed to shiver, the very ground trembling beneath their feet. The entity was pleased. With tears streaming down their faces, Sarah and Thomas knelt before their son, holding him close one last time. "Be brave, my love," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Be brave." Samuel looked up at her, his eyes filled with trust and innocence. "I will, Mama," he said softly, his small hand clutching hers. And then he was taken, swept away by unseen hands, his cries lost in the wind. The settlers watched in horror, their hearts breaking as the forest claimed its due. The settlers returned to their homes, their spirits broken. The bountiful harvest had come at a terrible cost, one that weighed heavily on their souls. Black Friday had claimed another innocent life, a sacrifice to the darkness that ensured their survival. Sarah and Thomas were inconsolable, their grief a raw, opened wound. They had lost their son, their bright, beautiful boy, to the entity that lurked in the forest. The price of prosperity had been paid, but at what cost? As the years passed, the memory of Samuel's sacrifice would linger, a dark shadow over their lives. The settlers would continue to honor the pact, for they knew that defiance would bring only ruin. But each year, as Black Friday approached, their hearts would fill with dread, knowing that the tax collector would come again, demanding its due. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked this video, please support it and this channel by giving this video a thumbs up. Also, please hit that subscribe button, and remember, enjoy the journey. See you next time.